Welcome back, everybody, to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe, and with me again is Sunny.
Hey, hey!
Before we get too serious, Sunny, you won't believe what happened to me at the grocery store the other day. I was in the international aisle. You know how I'm always on the lookout for some new weird snack?
Oh, yeah. Always bringing interesting treats to the recordings.
Well, this time I found a package with a picture of what looked like a pastry, but it turned out to be dried squid.
Dried squid?
Yeah, talk about a surprise, right?
Oh, Joe, you're braver than me. I'll stick to my potato chips. Thanks.
Hey, you never know. You got to try new things, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll even do a taste test in the next episode.
Yeah.
So, Sunny, you just got back from another trip, right? Almost had another passport issue, I heard.
Oh, my God. You're never going to let me live that down, are you? Yeah. I almost forgot it again, but this time I remembered.
Just in time, huh? Well, speaking of things that are just in time, I wanted to talk about Macron's speech the other day.
Oh, yeah.
He basically said Russia's not going to just stop with Ukraine.
Right. That speech was, I don't know, it was a little unsettling. I think he's really, really worried about what Russia wants to do, like their bigger ambitions and what that could mean for the rest of the world.
Yeah, like this isn't just about Ukraine anymore, is it? This is about the whole global power dynamic shifting, and everybody needs to sort of be ready.
Yeah, and when he talked about the casualties, that was really what got me. Almost 1 million people dead or wounded in this conflict already.
1 million people. Wow. That really puts things in perspective. I mean,
it does, and it makes you wonder, like, where does it end? You know? Could this spread? Could this impact our lives even over here?
that's a good question. And it's something to think about because even though it feels far away, what happens in Ukraine could definitely have effects all over the place. So we're going deep on French President Macron's recent speech, and he had some pretty strong words about Russia's intentions.
He really did.
So fill me in here. What makes Macron think that Russia has bigger plans?
Well, he points to Russia's actions in Ukraine since 2014. You know, the Minsk agreement, that ceasefire deal they broke. He's basically arguing that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior.
Yeah, that's fair. If someone's broken promises before, you're going to be a lot more hesitant to trust them the next time around. Kind of like lending money to that friend who always forgets to pay you back.
Exactly. And Macron's saying this is way more serious than a forgotten loan. This is about international security and the potential for a much wider conflict.
So it's not just about Ukraine then. What else is Macron concerned about?
Well, he's worried about Russia's actions on a global scale. He pointed out that North Korean soldiers and Iranian equipment are being used in the conflict.
Hey, North Korea and Iran are involved?
Yeah, it's getting complicated.
Yeah, things just got a whole lot more complex.
Right, and Macron doesn't stop there. He's also pointing to the assassinations of political opponents' election meddling in places like Romania and Moldova, and even cyber attacks on hospitals in Europe.
Cyber attacks on hospitals? That's just messed up. I mean, everyone gets frustrated with technology sometimes, but targeting people's health care, that's just crossing the line.
Totally. And remember all that talk about fake news and misinformation a few years back?
Oh, yeah.
Well, Macron says that Russia has been using social media to manipulate public opinion for years, trying to sow discord and weaken democracies.
It's kind of crazy how easy it is for misinformation to spread online. I remember this time my uncle was absolutely convinced that our local pizza place was secretly run by lizard people. I tried to tell him it was just a rumor, but he just wouldn't budge.
It's like everyone's an expert these days, and Macron's concerned that we're underestimating how vulnerable we are to these tactics.
And it's not just about like physical warfare, it's about information warfare too.
Exactly. And on top of all of that, Russia is pouring money into its military. We're talking over 40% of their budget is going to defense, and they're planning a huge increase in troops, tanks, fighter jets by 2030.
Wow, that's a lot of firepower. Sounds like they're gearing up for something big.
That's exactly Macron's point. All of these actions together, they paint a pretty clear picture of Russia's ambition. They're not content with being a regional power. They want to be a major player on the world stage. And they're willing to use force to get there.
Okay, so we've got a pretty alarming situation here. Russia's acting aggressively, building up its military, spreading misinformation. What does Macron think we should do about it?
Well, he's definitely not suggesting we surrender. He's calling for a stronger and more independent European defense.
A stronger Europe.
Yeah.
I like the sound of that. But how do we actually achieve that?
Well, Macron believes that Europe's future shouldn't be decided by Washington or Moscow. He's pushing for increased military spending across Europe joint production of military equipment, greater cooperation. So Europe can rely less on other countries for its security.
It's all more self-reliant Europe.
Exactly.
It's a pretty bold statement, isn't it? I mean, Europe relying on the U.S. for defense, that's been the status quo for a long time.
It has, but Macron is arguing that times are changing and Europe needs to step up.
So he's calling for a huge shift in how Europe approaches its defense. But what does that actually look like?
Well, he's got some concrete ideas. For one, he wants all EU members to increase their military spending to at least 2% of their GDP. He's also talking about a more unified approach to defense countries working together to develop and produce weapon systems.
That sounds like it would require a lot of coordination.
It does, but Macron's arguing that it's necessary to deter future aggression from Russia. He's essentially saying, look, we can either invest in our own security now, or we can pay a much higher price later.
It's like choosing between paying for a gym membership or dealing with health problems down the road.
Exactly.
And when it comes to global security, the potential health problems are pretty terrifying.
No kidding.
Okay, so increased military spending and a more unified approach to defense. Got it.
Yeah.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle we haven't talked about: nuclear weapons.
Right.
Macron also proposed expanding France's nuclear deterrent to protect other European allies. And that sparked a lot of debate. I mean, nuclear weapons are a whole other level of serious.
Right.
What are the arguments for and against Macron's proposal?
Well, some people argue that it's a necessary deterrent against Russian aggression. You know, the idea is if Russia knows it will face a nuclear response, it'll be less likely to attack in the first place. But on the other hand, some people are really worried about the risk of nuclear proliferation and the potential for things to, spiral out of control.
I can see both sides of the argument. It's a tough call.
It is, and Macron's walking a tightrope here, trying to balance reassuring allies and provoking Russia.
So a complex situation with no easy answers. But Macron's clearly trying to shake things up and get Europe to take a more active role in its own security.
Absolutely. He's calling for a major shift in mindset, from relying on others to taking responsibility for our own defense.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too, and it raises some important questions, for sure.
It does, about what the future holds for Europe and the world.
For sure.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from Russian aggression to European defense and the delicate balance of nuclear deterrence. Before we dive even deeper, let's take a quick pause to gather our thoughts and maybe grab a refill. We'll be right back to continue this conversation.
Okay, so we've got Macron calling for this stronger, more independent European defense, but what does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, stronger Europe sounds great on a poster, but how do you actually get 27 different countries each with their own priorities and, let's be real, their own stubborn streaks to agree on anything? It's got to be like herding cats, only the cats have tanks, and a fondness for really complicated treaties.
You're telling me, but Macron acknowledges those challenges. He's not naive about how hard it is to get everyone on the same page. But his point is that the threat from Russia is so serious, so potentially devastating, that it demands a level of unity and decisive action that we haven't seen in decades. It's about moving from a mindset of dependence to one of self-reliance, and that's a big shift for Europe.
So let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and more. Let's pool our resources and show the world we're not messing around.
Exactly. It's about Europe becoming strategically aligned, capable of defending its own interests and values without always having to rely on others.
Okay, I'm with you so far, but where do we even begin? Does Macron have like a step-by-step plan for how to turn Europe into this defense powerhouse?
Well, he does lay out some key areas where he thinks Europe needs to focus. First, increased military spending across the board. He wants all EU member states to hit that target of 2% of GDP on defense that we talked about earlier. He also wants to see greater cooperation in research and development. Instead of each country trying to develop its own weapons systems, he's suggesting that they work together to create a more efficient and cost-effective approach.
So like a European version of DARPA, but for tanks and fighter jets instead of super soldier serums.
Yeah, something like that. And it's not just about tanks and jets. He also wants to see more investment in cybersecurity intelligence, sharing all the other elements that go into a modern defense strategy.
Makes sense. You can't just focus on the hardware. You need the software and the brainpower too. But even if Europe does get its act together on all of that, can it really replace the U.S. as the main guarantor of security? The U.S. has been the big dog on the block for so long. Can Europe really fill those shoes?
That's a huge question, and there's a lot of debate about whether it's even possible or desirable. Some people argue that Europe simply doesn't have the military capabilities or the political will to go it alone. Others say that it's not about replacing the U.S., but about creating a more balanced partnership where Europe takes on more responsibility for its own defense. Macron seems to be in that second camp.
So it's not necessarily about breaking up with the U.S., but maybe going on a little break to figure out who we are and what we want.
That's a good way to put it. It's about becoming a more mature and independent partner capable of contributing more to the alliance. And Macron argues that this isn't just about security, it's also an opportunity for Europe to redefine its role in the world, to become a more assertive and influential actor on the global stage.
A Europe that's not just a big economic bloc, but also a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. I like the sound of that. But let's be real for a second. Money talks and all this defense stuff is expensive. Are European countries actually willing to cough up the cash to make this happen? I know I'd rather spend my euros on travel and delicious food than on tanks and fighter jets.
You and me both, but Macron's betting that the perceived threat from Russia is now so real, so immediate, that it will force European governments to prioritize defense spending in a way they haven't before. We've already seen some countries like Germany significantly increase their defense budgets in response to the war in Ukraine.
So it's a gamble, but one that Macron thinks is worth taking.
Exactly. He's essentially making the case that the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of investment.
He sees NATO as essential for European security, but he also believes that it needs to be complemented by a stronger European pillar capable of acting independently when necessary. So working within the existing framework, but also pushing for more European autonomy.
Exactly. And he wants to see closer cooperation between national militaries. This could include things like joint training exercises, sharing of intelligence, and even the creation of multinational units that could be deployed quickly in response to crises.
So less of a patchwork of individual armies and more of a cohesive European force that can operate seamlessly together.
That's the idea, but of course the devil is in the details. Getting 27 countries to agree on things like command structures, procurement processes, and rules of engagement, that's a massive undertaking.
It's like trying to get everyone in your extended family to agree on where to go for dinner. It's never going to be smooth sailing.
I can only imagine the diplomatic headaches, but despite the challenges, Macron seems convinced that a more integrated European defense is not only necessary, but also achievable.
Okay, so we've talked about increased spending, closer cooperation, working within existing institutions like NATO. But what about the elephant in the room, the nuclear issue? We touched on it earlier, but I think it deserves a deeper dive. Macron's proposal to extend France's nuclear umbrella to other European countries. That's a pretty big deal. What are the implications of that?
It's definitely a controversial idea, and there are strong arguments on both sides. Some people argue that it's a necessary step to deter Russian aggression, particularly given Putin's, not so subtle threats about using nuclear weapons. The thinking is that if Russia knows it'll face a nuclear response from multiple European countries, not just France, it'll be even less likely to even think about an attack. But on the other hand, critics worry that extending the nuclear umbrella could actually make Europe less safe. They argue that it could increase tensions with Russia, make it harder to control the spread of nuclear weapons, and even increase the risk of accidental or unauthorized use.
So it's a high-stakes game with potentially huge consequences.
Exactly. And it's a decision that European leaders will need to make very carefully, weighing the risks and benefits.
It's a good reminder that we're not just talking about abstract policy debates here. These are decisions that could have a very real impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. And that brings us to an important question. What does all this talk of military spending, nuclear deterrence, and a more assertive Europe actually mean for the average person? How might these big geopolitical shifts affect our daily lives?
Yeah, because I think a lot of people are probably listening to this and thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, but how does it actually impact me?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but if Macron's vision becomes reality, we could see some pretty significant changes in Europe. We could see a more militarized society with increased defense budgets, a more visible military presence, and maybe even the return of conscription in some countries.
Wait, conscription? Like mandatory military service? Seriously?
It's not something that's being widely discussed right now, but it's not entirely off the table either. Some countries like Finland and Sweden, which are now joining NATO, already have conscription. And as the security situation in Europe continues to deteriorate, it's possible that other countries might consider reintroducing it.
Wow, that would be a major change. I mean, I can barely get myself to the gym on a regular basis.
Yeah.
The thought of being forced to do military drills and learn how to fire a rifle is pretty daunting.
It would definitely be a big adjustment, but it highlights how serious the situation is and how much things could change in the coming years.
Okay, so we could be looking at more spending on defense, a more visible military presence, maybe even conscription. What else? How might these changes affect the economy, for example?
That's a good question. Some people argue that increased defense spending could actually stimulate economic growth, creating jobs and boosting innovation in areas like technology and manufacturing. Others worry that it could divert resources away from other priorities like healthcare, education, social welfare.
So there are potential upsides and downsides to consider.
Exactly. And it's not just about economics. A more assertive Europe could also have implications for foreign policy, diplomacy, even our cultural identity.
So it's not just about building more tanks and fighter jets. It's about rethinking Europe's role in the world and what it means to be European in the 21st century. We'll be right back. Have ripple effects.
Exactly. And it's not just about Russia either. We got to think about other world powers who might be watching this whole thing very closely. And I'm talking about China.
Yeah, China's been awfully quiet this whole time. But I remember right before the invasion, they made that no limits partnership declaration with Russia.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole thing so worrying, because some analysts think that China is like taking notes from Russia's playbook. You know, like if Russia can redraw borders by force, why not China?
And we know China has its eyes on Taiwan. I mean, they've never been shy about that.
Exactly. Taiwan is a breakaway province that needs to be brought back into the fold, and they've said that they will use force if necessary, and they've been increasing the pressure for years now. Military exercises, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, the whole 9 yards.
Do you think they'd actually go as far as a full-scale invasion? I mean, that seems like a pretty risky move, even for China.
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, some analysis from Youytube Mickytolife suggests that they might not even stop at Taiwan. You know, once they solidify their position there, they could be looking at other territories too.
Wow, so it's not just Taiwan. What else are they looking at?
Well, they've been busy in the South China Sea for years, building artificial islands and militarizing them, even though international courts have said those aren't their territories.
Right, that whole 9-dash line thing where they just draw a line and say, all of this is ours.
Exactly. It's all part of this bigger plan to expand their control and their influence. It's not as in your face as a military invasion, but it's still incredibly aggressive.
And then there's the whole Belt and Road Initiative, right? They say it's all about economic development, but isn't that also a way for them to gain more power around the world?
Totally. They're using their economic power to create a network of countries that owe them favors. It's a pretty smart strategy.
It's also kind of scary, though, right? It's like they're playing this long game, slowly tightening their grip.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. And it makes you wonder, if Russia succeeds in Ukraine and China takes Taiwan, does that embolden them to push even further?
Like a domino effect.
Well,
one country's aggression leads to another.
Exactly. And that could have huge consequences for the entire world.
Okay, this is sounding pretty grim. What can the rest of the world do to push back against this? Are other countries just sitting back and watching?
Well, we are seeing a lot of alliances forming. Countries are realizing they can't go it alone anymore, and they need to band together for protection.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, there's the Quad, the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. They've all teamed up to counter China in the Indo-Pacific region.
What about AUKUS? Wasn't that a pretty big deal?
Yeah, AUKUS is a partnership between Australia, the U.K., and the U.S. It's focused on things like nuclear submarines and advanced military tech, and it's definitely meant as a direct response to China's military buildup.
So are we basically in a new arms race then? Everybody's got to have the biggest weapons?
It's starting to feel that way, yeah. And countries like Japan and Australia are increasing their military spending, too.
What about Europe? What are they doing?
Europe's response has been a little more nuanced, but they're definitely paying attention. The EU is talking about de-risking from China.
De-risking? What does that even mean?
Basically, it means relying less on China economically and planning for what might happen if things go south in the Taiwan Strait. They're realizing that depending so much on China might be a bad idea if things escalate.
So is everyone just getting ready for the worst then? Is a big global conflict inevitable?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a sure thing, but there are definitely some worrying signs. It's important to understand the potential risks.
Okay, I'm officially nervous now. Is there anything that could stop Russia and China from getting more aggressive? Is there any hope?
Well, it's not all doom and gloom. China has some problems at home that might make them think twice about starting a big conflict.
Okay, tell me the good news. I need to hear something positive.
Well, they've got an economic slowdown happening, a real estate crisis. They're dealing with a ton of local government debt, and their population is getting older. All those problems might make them focus on fixing things at home instead of starting a war.
It's a good reminder that even powerful countries have their own struggles.
Exactly. And then you've got the U.S. trying to limit China's technological development, especially when it comes to semiconductors.
The chip war, whoever controls the most advanced chips controls the future.
Exactly. And the U.S. wants to stay ahead. And then there's China's image on the world stage.
Yeah, that hasn't been so great lately.
Nope. All their aggressive actions and the human rights issues have really hurt their reputation. If they want to be a global leader, they need other countries to like them. Alienating everyone isn't a good strategy.
So we're not headed for World War III, for sure.
Not necessarily. It's complicated. There are a lot of factors, and it's impossible to say for sure what'll happen. But understanding how this all works, the motivations, the strategies, the potential problems, that's the first step to figuring out how to deal with this increasingly uncertain world.
It's a relief. I was starting to sweat there. You're right. Understanding what's going on is crucial.
It is, and it's something we should all be paying attention to. You know, I was thinking about something you said before about understanding global dynamics being so important, especially in this uncertain world.
Yeah, totally. And it's not just about the big picture either. It's about understanding how those big things affect our everyday lives.
Right, exactly. Like with Ukraine and how it affected gas prices and even groceries.
Yeah, it's like a real reminder that everything's connected, even if we don't always see it.
Exactly. And it's not just money either.
Right.
Think about information, how that's being affected by the war and China's growing power.
That's interesting. The way we get our news is always changing, and it's important to be aware of what might be shaping those narratives.
Yeah.
You know, any biases or agendas.
For sure. We can't just believe everything we see and hear. We have to be critical thinkers, especially now with so much misinformation and propaganda out there.
So how do we do that? How do we get better at figuring out what's real?
Well, like we talked about before, getting your news from different places is key. Don't just rely on one news outlet or social media platform. Look for different opinions and challenge your own assumptions.
Yeah, I know I can get stuck in my own little bubble sometimes.
We all do. It's natural. But it's important to try to step outside our comfort zones and see things from different angles.
It's like trying different whiskeys, right?
Yeah.
You might find a new favorite that you never would have known about otherwise.
I like that. So back to what we were talking about before, solutions. Is there any hope for a peaceful resolution to all of this?
That's the big question, and I'm not sure there's any easy answers, but what can we do to move towards a more peaceful future? I need some optimism here.
Well, first of all, we need to focus on diplomacy and talking to each other. We have to keep those lines of communication open, even with people we don't agree with. It's about finding ways to build trust, even when things are tense.
That sounds really hard, especially now when everyone seems so divided.
It is a challenge, but it's not impossible. We've seen throughout history that even the worst enemies can find ways to come together and work things out.
Any examples? Because right now it seems like we're just moving further and further apart.
Well, look at the Cold War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union were rivals for decades, and it almost destroyed the world. But they were able to figure out a way to coexist peacefully through diplomacy and talking.
That's true. It's easy to forget how close we came to total disaster back then.
It is, but it reminds us that there's always hope for peace, even when things look really bad.
So diplomacy is important.
Yeah.
What else can we do to encourage peace?
We have to address the things that cause conflict in the first place. Poverty, inequality, and justice. Those are the things that fuel violence and make the world unstable.
So it's not just about military power or political games.
Nope. It's about creating a fairer world where everyone has a chance to succeed.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So how do we do that?
It's complicated, but it starts with things like investing in education, healthcare, and economic development. It's about giving people the tools they need to build a better life for themselves and their communities.
So it's a long-term solution, not something that happens overnight.
Exactly. Peace is a marathon, not a sprint. It takes patience and a commitment to working together to create a better world.
I like that. A marathon for peace. It sounds exhausting, though.
It can be, but it's also really rewarding. Imagine a world where we don't have to constantly worry about war. Imagine our kids growing up in a world without fear and violence. That's the world we should be working towards.
Maybe we should take a little break to clear our heads and grab another sip of something refreshing.
Sounds good to me. Sometimes you need a little mental palate cleanser before you dive back into the heavy stuff.
Speaking of palate cleansers,
Yeah.
speaking of palate cleansers, we've got to give a shout out to our buddy Micky over at Mickytolife on YouTube.
Oh, yeah, Micky?
He used to be all about travel vlogs and whiskey reviews.
Yeah, sharing his adventures with the world one distillery at a time.
Exactly. But apparently he's traded in his travel gear and tasting glass for a microphone and some recording equipment.
Really?
Yeah, his channel's gone full musical maestro these days. He's making his own music now.
Wow, that's quite a change. What kind of music is he making?
Honestly, it's hard to describe. It's like electronica meets Gregorian chants with a dash of experimental jazz thrown in for good measure.
Okay, that's pretty unique. Definitely not your typical top 40 hits.
Nope, not at all. But it's actually pretty fascinating stuff. Kind of makes you think, you know. And hey, maybe it'll be the perfect soundtrack for navigating this whole stronger Europe situation.
You never know. Maybe there's some hidden geopolitical wisdom embedded in those synth melodies and chanting monks.
Exactly. So if you're looking for something a little different, a little off the beaten path, head over to YouTube and search for Mickytolife. You might be surprised at what you discover.
Always up for expanding my musical horizons.
Me too. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into Macron's vision for Europe. We've covered a lot of ground, from the immediate threat posed by Russia to the bigger picture of what it means for Europe to take on a more active role in global affairs.
It has been a fascinating discussion, and I think it really highlights those complexities and uncertainties that Europe is facing right now.
No doubt, there are no easy answers here. But Macron's speech has definitely sparked a crucial debate about what kind of future we want for Europe and what we're willing to do to achieve it.
Yeah, it's a debate that all of us as citizens need to engage in. We need to ask ourselves some tough questions about what we value, what risks we're willing to take, and what kind of world we want to leave for future generations.
Well said. So to our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought. Keep those brains buzzing, keep those conversations flowing, and remember, as always, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
And maybe pour yourself another drink while you ponder all those big questions. Cheers to that.